Hey there, I'm John Schwartz, a climate change reporter for the New York Times. On behalf of the Texas Tribune, I'm thrilled to welcome you to the 2020 Texas Tribune Festival and our session, The Heat is On. This session will last 30 minutes and will be made up of two panels. You'll be hearing from some amazing people today, and that's good because our topic is as important as it gets, climate change. This is an auspicious time to be discussing the problems of a warming world, with wildfires scorching much of the American West, thanks in large part to the drying of the landscape, and a hurricane season so busy that we've run out of English language names for our hurricanes. The meteorologists, for only the second time, have moved on into the Greek alphabet. By now, you must all be familiar with climate change and its effects, and if you aren't, might I suggest you read a newspaper called the New York Times? And while we're all feeling its effects to some extent, what gets less coverage is the unequal ways that climate change can affect different groups, including the impact on those in poverty and within communities of color. In many ways, climate change is a racial issue. It's a gender issue. It's a generational issue. We have four guests today. Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson is a marine biologist, policy expert, and Brooklyn native. She is co-creator and co-host of the Spotify Gimlet podcast, How to Save a Planet, and co-edited the anthology, All We Can Save. Dr. Robert Bullard is a distinguished professor at Texas Southern University and is known as the father of environmental justice. He is the author of 18 books and has co-founded historically Black colleges and universities Climate Change Consortium, among other organizations. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe is a professor at Texas Tech and one of the most accomplished communicators of climate science out there. She hosts the PBS digital series called Global Weirding. Varshini Prakash is executive director and co-founder of the Sunrise Movement, which advocates for political action on climate change. She is the author of Winning the Green New Deal, Why We Must, How We Can. Let's get down to it. Our first two guests are Doctors Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and Robert Bullard. Let's start. Dr. Bullard, when people ask you to explain what environmental justice means, what do you tell them, and how does that become climate justice?
Well, environmental justice embraces the principle that all communities and people are entitled to equal protection of our environmental laws, housing, transportation, energy, health, and civil rights laws. And so when we talk about the issue of environmental justice, and then we talk about climate change is more than parts per million in greenhouse gases. There's another aspect that deals with equity, fairness, and responsibility and vulnerability. And so if we were to address really climate impacts that cut across geographic areas, but also have disparate impact on people, places. And so if we're to come up with really climate resilient communities, we have to address the issue of vulnerability. That's where climate justice comes in.
Right. And Dr. Johnson, you talk about building communities around climate solutions. What's an example of that? How can you explain what that means?
I think one of the sort of shortcomings in some sense of the climate movement has been this focus, sort of like the mainstream large organizations climate movement, I should be more specific, has been this focus on, sort of either policy change in a way that makes people feel like they can't be part of it, or individual action, which is never going to be enough. And of course, I care about, my own individual impact on the world, but I think the greater opportunity, as opposed to asking, what can I do, is asking, what can we do together? And so figuring out how people can come together, how communities can come together, how organizations can foster this sense of collectivism, because that is what is needed when we're facing such a massive problem.
To
give a specific example, I think one of the most exciting things we've seen in the last year or so in the climate movement has been the work to push for a Green New Deal at the federal level, which has had a lot of different people involved in it. And one group of youth climate activists, Sunrise Movement, has been really charging ahead with that messaging. And that has given people a way to be a part of pushing for policy change, so that it's not just politicians in a room behind closed doors making decisions that affect all of us, but is instead part of a really concrete movement for making sure that the United States has strong, comprehensive, visionary federal level policy in place to get us where we need to go in terms of bringing our greenhouse gas emissions down to zero as soon as possible.
And Dr. Bullard, when we see environmental justice issues in the press, the communities that we talk about are often portrayed as victims, as passive victims with no role to play except to be those victims. That's not really what the movement is about, is it? Could you go into that a little bit? What role people play in their own destinies?
Well, the environmental justice movement was born out of fighting back injustice. If there were not injustice, we would not need an environmental justice movement. And so, because of the community's strong desire to live in a healthy, sustainable, livable environment, people have put their lives on the line to fight for clean air and to clean water and safe neighborhoods, and have actually gone up against some of the largest corporations in this country with meager resources, and in many cases have won and have forced our government, local, state, and federal government, to move toward equal protection of our environmental laws. No, communities are not just laying back, getting poisoned and getting polluted and saying we can't do anything about it. They are forcing these issues on the front line, and from the grassroots all the way up to the state house, as well as the Congress and the President of the United States. 1994, President Clinton signed the executive order on environmental justice. The state of New Jersey just passed a very strong environmental justice law. And so communities that are fighting, struggling, they see their rights being violated, and they're fighting back. And in some cases, in many cases, they are winning. But it's a long-term struggle that communities have to address. Systemic racism, economic injustice, discriminatory land use planning and zoning, as well as unequal protection. This is a fight to the death, and most communities are choosing life.
And Dr. Johnson, on your podcast, which is terrific, you and your co-host described recently a little bit of a conflict over language, which centered on the word fix. Could you tell me a little more about that?
Oh, yeah. I think there's this notion, which is a bit naive, that we can fix climate change or solve climate change or somehow like make it go away. And the scientific truth is that the climate has already changed. We're already seeing the impacts. We're already seeing, as Dr. Bullard described, that those impacts are not spread evenly, that it is communities of color, poor communities who are bearing the greatest brunt, whether it is, hurricanes and flooding or droughts and heat waves and fires, people who don't have the resources based on, historical discrimination and being disadvantaged as a matter of policy, who do now not have the resources to adapt, as well as more privileged communities to all these changes that we're already seeing. And so when we use language like sort of like defeat climate change or fix climate change or solve climate change, it strikes me as, sort of a dangerous use of those words, because we can't just make it go away. If this were a problem where a bunch of engineers in a conference room somewhere could just like come up with some solution and fix it, it would already be fixed. But that's not where we are. We're in a situation where, as Dr. Bullard says, communities have been advocating for themselves and for a clean and healthy and protected environment for decades. And it's really important to acknowledge and support that leadership, because what we need in this moment is actually people from every community leading their communities forward when it comes to climate solutions. because a lot of these things are going to get implemented at the local level. A lot of these decisions about the transition to renewable energy, about how we manage waste, about composting, about land use, about agricultural practices, about building codes and efficiency. A lot of these decisions happen at a local level, and so the local organizations and the climate and environmental justice groups in particular need to be fully supported, because they are the leading edge, the creative and insightful individuals and entities that have solutions at hand and need to be fully resourced and able to make all of that a reality, which will make all of us better off.
And Dr. Bullard, you recently helped relaunch the Black Environmental Justice Network, which you had originally helped co-found. Tell us why you chose this moment to bring back this organization.
Well, originally we founded the National Black Environmental Justice Network in 1999. And it was an emergency back then of so much pollution and industries concentrated in Black neighborhoods and basically creating all kinds of health problems. And fast forward this year in July, because of the conversion threats of COVID-19, the rollbacks of environmental regulations, looking at the issues around health, dismantling the Affordable Care Act and voter suppression, and having our essential workers going out in meeting those jobs and not being able to telework or work from home. These conversion threats were creating tremendous problems and disparities in Black America. And so we said we need a national organization that's going to tackle these conversion threats, simultaneous threats that are converging on us. And that's why we brought back the organization. We called up many of our old members and we brought in new members, intergenerational operations to work on these issues simultaneously. And then you look at the fact that so many Black men and women are being killed innocently by police. And so you talk about I can't breathe. And you talk about communities that have been saying I can't breathe for decades because of being surrounded by these polluting industries. This was the magic moment that we had to say, we must act. And as John Lewis said, if you see something, do something. And it's time to get in some good trouble. That's why we brought it back. And that's why we are active on the front line to work with our communities to speak for themselves and to make change.
And Dr. Johnson, in your podcast and your new book, you've got Christine Nieves Rodriguez talking about through Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And it was such a moving segment on the podcast. What does her experience tell us in such an amazing story about people coming together in a climate-fueled crisis?
Yeah. I think, unfortunately, the sad lesson of Hurricane Maria is that our federal government has become inept at responding to extreme weather events. And part of that is certainly fueled by racism, in the same way that we saw it in Katrina, where the government does not feel compelled to respond in an urgent, all hands on deck manner when it is people of color whose lives are at risk. And so her story of just like waiting for help to come, realizing that it wasn't going to come, that they had, no electricity, they had no food, and they all had to just come together as a community. And her work to build resilience at the community level, because we know the next storm will come, is so inspiring, because, they set up their own community kitchen to feed each other, and accepted donations and just like made it work. They set up their own community Wi-Fi. They set up their own solar powered community laundromat, right? There's so much we can do to be prepared and resilient at a local level. But of course, all of that points to the absurdity of not being able to trust our elected officials to look out for us. And so there is so much at stake in this election when it comes to the climate policies that we'll have as a country and the emissions and stable climate we will have globally. And so it's an honor and sort of overwhelming to releasing this book, All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. At this moment, it is 40 essays by women climate leaders talking about all these different elements of what we can and must do. And, in addition to listening to people of color generally when it comes to environmental solutions, women of color have been doing some incredible work, innovating and, organizing. And we wanted to make sure to let them tell their stories and shine a light on what they're pointing to as the ways forward.
Dr. Bullard, we're talking at the Texas Tribune Festival. What has your time in Texas taught you about environmental justice and climate justice?
I think being in Texas over these many decades has really taught me that persistence and understanding that if we are to achieve environmental, economic, and climate justice, we have to take an intergenerational approach to this and to build on previous movements, whether it was civil rights movement and women's movement or movement for economic justice. I think the idea that we are in Texas, we are on the front line of climate change, and that we have to build multi-generational movements, and we have to make sure that we are inclusive. And as these dangerous storms bear down on us, and as sea level rise, and as heat waves when it gets too hot to work outside, we have to talk about climate change. And climate change is climate justice, is economic justice, is racial justice, is energy justice. And being in Texas, we have to make sure that all those things converge and come together. We're getting there, and I think if we can do it in Texas, it can happen everywhere.
Texas is a leader on wind-powered energy, so I think that is a really good sign that of what is possible.
It is amazing. Dr. Johnson, Dr. Bullard, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Our next guests are Katharine Hayhoe and Varshini Prakash. Katharine, we've spoken before, and you've told me that you actually have hope when it comes to climate change. That often takes people by surprise. What do you mean by that?
My hope doesn't come from the science, because every new scientific study we see shows that things are worse than we thought. And it doesn't come from the politics either. But I find hope in seeing what people are doing, because people care about this issue today more than ever. And especially looking at all of the young voices who are telling us that the world not only must change, that it can change. That's what gives me hope.
Terrific. And of course, we have one of those young people here. Varshini, let's talk about your work with the movement, and you've taken this fight to the halls of Congress and now into the presidential campaign. How do you see the coming election shaping up?
That is a very long and complicated answer to that question, John. But in the grand scheme of things, I think the piece that sort of dovetails with what Katharine just said is I'm feeling a lot of hope for how fired up young people are right now. It is a terrifying election. I don't think it is hyperbolic to say that the future of humankind and life as we know it rests on the outcome of this election and what we do in the months and years following. But I have seen young people participating in our politics in unprecedented numbers. Sunrise ran a whole bunch of campaigns for down ballot candidates, electing insurgent progressives who have vowed to fight tooth and nail on the climate crisis and make it one of their core campaign priorities. We saw 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds who won't be able to vote for a number of years, organizing literally hundreds of other teenagers to make calls for Green New Deal champions over the last few months. And we're gearing up over the coming in September and October to ensure that we make millions of phone calls and dials to young voters, particularly young voters of color in swing states in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. And so, it's terrifying odds, but at the same time, I think we're seeing activation from young people in numbers and with an enthusiasm that I've never seen before.
Terrific. And Katharine, Dr. Hayhoe, when you talk about people's understanding of climate change, you clearly have numbers in mind. How are you seeing public acceptance of climate science and how it might play into this 2020 election?
Well, as of this year, 70% of people in the United States agree that climate is changing. Almost 60% of people are either alarmed or concerned about climate change. But here's the problem. Only 40% of us think it actually matters to us. And if we don't think it matters to us, then why would we need to do anything to fix it right now? Not only that, but climate change remains the most politically polarized issue in the entire country. It's been at this point since the Obama administration, but just as of last month, it continues to be number one, with issues of racial justice as number 2 and coronavirus as number 3.
So let's talk a little bit more about, Varshini, you talked about the down ballot races and the influence of young people in that. You've done a lot of focus on the top of the ballot. Early on, y'all gave Joe Biden an F on climate issues, if I remember. Now, y'all are both supporting him, and you yourself are on his climate task force. Talk about that as a transition, as an evolution. What happened there?
Yeah. So I got nominated by Senator Bernie Sanders to be on his Sanders and Joe Biden's unity task force on the climate crisis. And so I worked alongside 7 other members to essentially achieve as close to possible for a unity position for the Democratic Party on climate change. And going into this process, really our goal was to come out of it with a plan that would excite and energize youth voters around Joe Biden, understanding that no matter what, whoever the Democratic nominee for president was, and whoever it was going to be, even though we supported Bernie Sanders in the primary, we knew that it would be essential to defeat Trump. And so through that process, we were actually able to push Joe Biden to make commitments to move up his timelines on decarbonizing the power sector by 15 years from 2050 to 2035. He now has a $2 trillion green jobs and infrastructure plan with 40% of those investments going directly to communities of color and low-income communities. He has a program to employ young people in doing the essential work of cleaning up our environment and combating climate change. And so, we've seen a dramatic transformation in his climate plans just over the last few months. And I think what is essential about that is, even though Joe Biden isn't the candidate that I would have wanted, I don't even know if he's in the top 5 of the candidates that I would have wanted at the beginning of this whole primary season. The truth is, he has shown that he is movable and that he is susceptible to external pressure from movements and from other elected officials. And that is an essential characteristic for any change agent or any person or demographic of people that are looking to create transformations on the scale of what we want to do to combat the climate crisis. And so, yes, we are campaigning for Joe Biden, and we're working in many of these swing states really to turn out voters as much as possible, understanding that this election could be life and death.
And you still don't agree on all points. You don't agree on the Green New Deal necessarily, on fracking. Could you go into that a little bit and what that means for your support?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly points of disagreement. I believe that we have got to make commitments around getting off of fossil fuels, and we needed to have done that yesterday. Yes, Joe Biden doesn't want to say the words Green New Deal, but at the same time, I mean, there is literally no comparison between Joe Biden's vision of a climate agenda and Donald Trump's. And in fact, Donald Trump would take us, frankly, it is almost too terrifying to imagine what it would mean to lose 4 or 5 more years of installing action on climate change. And I don't think we can afford that. And so, our plan is get Joe Biden elected, defeat Donald Trump, elect Green New Deal champions up and down the ballot, continue to build the movement and develop young leaders and help them figure out how they can take action all across this country. And then come November 4th or whenever we know who is going to win this presidency, and if it's Joe Biden, put the pressure on him every single day to ensure that a green recovery, that a green jobs and infrastructure plan is a critical piece of his first 100 days agenda.
All right. And Katharine, Dr. Hayhoe, what do you think are the important factors when it comes to getting the word out about climate change? In other words, as you say, there are surprising numbers of people who aren't yet completely on board, despite the strength of the science. You've really looked into what changes minds. So what are the key factors?
As I mentioned, climate change is the number one most politically polarized issue in the entire country. What that means is our opinion on climate change is not shaped by how much science we know, how smart we are, or how educated we are. It is simply formed by where we fall on the political spectrum. But a thermometer isn't Democrat or Republican. It doesn't give us a different answer depending on how we vote. Climate is changing. Humans are responsible. We've known that for over 150 years. And today we know the impacts are serious and they're no longer a future issue. They are here and they are now. So the most important thing I've found is to connect the dots between the values people already have and how climate change is affecting them today, to show them that who they are is already the perfect person to care about climate change. And there are positive, constructive solutions that involve growing jobs, growing the economy, continuing to provide energy to people, cleaning up our air and our water, benefits that we see today as well as in the future that everybody can get on board with, again, no matter where they fall on the political spectrum.
And what about the idea of who they need to hear the message from? As a reporter, I like to think that by writing my stories and getting the word out, I am helping to shift the persuadable toward a better understanding of the science. But you've looked at a lot of research that suggests that there might be other factors, other speakers involved in getting the word out. So don't spare my feelings here. What works?
Well, first of all, we all need to be talking about climate change. And when they ask people, do you ever have a conversation about climate change? Only about 30 to 35% of people say yes, even occasionally. And then they said, do you ever hear about it in the media? Only 25% of people in the year 2020 said that they hear about climate change in the media. So absolutely, we need to hear about it. But the social science has showed something very interesting. The most effective messenger to have a conversation, not hitting people upside the head with dire scientific facts, but showing people how it matters to us here and now and what we can do to fix it. The number one most effective messenger is you. And by you, I mean every single person listening to this. Friends and family are most effective. Scientists are only number two. People who are healthcare experts are also effective. Military leaders, faith leaders, people whose opinions we trust, what the science calls elite cues. So thought leaders who we agree with are the people that we listen to. So having these conversations really does make a difference because, again, climate change is not a right or a left, a red or a blue issue. Climate change is a human issue.
And this question could go to either of you. It's really about the coronavirus and the crisis that we've been in this year. There are some pretty clear similarities between the way we've dealt with climate change and the way we've dealt with this coronavirus as a nation. Varshini, let's start with you. I'd like to hear what both of you have to say. Is this something that you've thought about at all? And do you see any parallels?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a number of things, and in particular, just the way in which our president, but also this entire administration, really an entire wing of our government, has absolutely completely failed millions and millions of people by sowing complete misinformation about the science, which is a strategy that they have done on regarding fossil fuels and the reality of the climate crisis for the last 50 years. I mean, it was, ExxonMobil that had some of the best science on this issue back in the 60s and 70s, and they buried it, and then they spent millions and millions of dollars confusing people about it, and that's why we're in the dire situation that we're in right now. And so I think it's astonishing. It is frankly criminal. The levels of willful misleading are happening by this administration, and I think we've got to get an administration into power that respects the truth and respects the pursuit of the truth, at least, and science.
And Dr. Hayhoe, what do you see here?
We have seen so many parallels between the coronavirus pandemic and climate change that we cannot afford to miss the lessons that we've learned this year. First of all, we have absolutely seen that the very same people who reject the reality of climate change are also rejecting the severity of the pandemic, the very sensible means that we can take to prevent the risk of infections, like wearing masks. The same people are spreading myths about the same two topics. But what we also saw is that when the coronavirus first started, we had the same issue we have with climate change. We thought it was distant in space. It was happening over there, but not here. We thought it was distant in time. It was a future issue, but not now. But all too soon, we realized that it was here and it was now, and we had only a very narrow window of time to respond. And that was what happened at the beginning of March. And today with climate change, again, we are at the beginning of March. It is no longer distant. It is right here. And we have a very narrow window of time to respond, not to make it all better because some of the impacts are already here today, but to avoid the worst of the impacts. We still have that choice today. And that's why it's becoming increasingly urgent that we start making it.
Wow. Well, it's been terrific talking with you both. I thank you both for being here today. Again, climate change and the coronavirus are all about understanding the science and dealing with it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Aaron Knight, and I work for KUTX 98.9. I think most people look at me and like, you're not ashamed to ride the bus? Why? It's what Capital Metro is made for, to help me maneuver through the city and get to where I need to be. No shame in that.